Hey everyone, we're Group 6, and today we will be discussing neural networks and consciousness. We will start off our discussion today with an introduction to consciousness, followed by the evolution of the human brain, brain structure and relation to consciousness, technology and the future for consciousness research, followed by ethical implications, and finally our concluding points. Consciousness is at the heart of our existence as human beings. It allows us to think, feel, communicate, and interact with the world around us. To be conscious is to be aware of our very existence. The journey to understanding consciousness is complicated and still widely misunderstood. Studies of consciousness are of interest in many fields, including philosophy, neuroscience, cognitive science, and psychology. Consciousness studies also have medical applications in fields like psychiatry and neurology. In order to fully understand consciousness, we must use information from all of these fields and more. One of the biggest debates in consciousness research comes from the mind-body problem, which concerns to what extent the mind and body are separate or the same. The relationship between the physical body and what we know as consciousness is still unknown. Some believe that the mind and the body to be separate, seeing consciousness as something bigger than just our physical form. Others see the mind and the body to be the same, believing that the structure and functions of our brain is what gives rise to what we know as consciousness and nothing beyond that. There are no current and widely accepted theories of consciousness. To understand consciousness is to understand what many may think is unexplainable. What is the mind? How is the mind related to our physical matter? Is the mind the workings of the body or something beyond the body? Research in consciousness often shifts or is involved with highly subjective questions about life. What is the meaning of life? What is the nature of the universe? Since such types of questions are subjective, many people have their own theories and beliefs about consciousness. However, there is a lack of empirical evidence when it comes to studies on consciousness. This is what makes research in this area difficult. Because consciousness is at least in some part subjective, it is difficult to study it using the scientific method. Despite this, people have been thinking about consciousness for centuries. Some may even say that the history of thinking about consciousness stretches as early as human thought itself. Even thousands of years ago, people were asking questions about their own existence. This is in part because of the prevalence of research in this area. The way that we interpret the world around us depends on consciousness. Without our consciousness, we would not be able to understand math, physics, or language. Consciousness defines us as individuals. It is who we are. The desire to understand consciousness comes from the desire to understand oneself. The nature of consciousness is still unknown. We don't know why we are conscious. Without understanding this, it is difficult to develop a definition that encompasses all of what it means to be conscious, as it is difficult to define a biological term when there are still so many unknowns. Despite the lack of a formal definition, what do we know about consciousness? Many philosophers and scientists see consciousness as being synonymous with experience, conscious awareness, and awareness. When someone is conscious, they have experiences. In contrast, when someone is unconscious, they lack experiences. It is important, however, to recognize distinctions in the journey to defining consciousness. Some believe that consciousness is synonymous with the mind, but we know that this is not true because the mind performs not only mental operations that are conscious, but also operations that are unconscious or outside of our awareness. Therefore, consciousness is only one aspect of the mind. Some believe that consciousness itself and to be conscious of something are separate concepts altogether. This led to a two-model system proposed by philosopher Ned Block in 1995. Phenomenal consciousness defines experience and describes what it is like to be in a certain state of experience. Phenomenal consciousness is often closely related to sensory experiences like hearing, smelling, tasting, or pain. Phenomenal consciousness is the experience of these sensations, or how it feels to experience such things, and what types of emotions are associated with a certain experience. In contrast, access consciousness includes information that is available for use in reasoning and for the control of action and speech. Access consciousness includes what we are able to report to ourselves and to others, or what is under our direct awareness. Access consciousness has intentionality, defined as the idea that mental states are in reference to something, while phenomenal consciousness does not always have this aspect. Everything we know about the way we think and experience the world is highly individual, making it difficult to escape introspection when it comes to studying consciousness. Due to the subjective nature of phenomenal consciousness and lack of cognitive or measurable features, can this be studied empirically? Can it be quantified? Can it be replicated? These questions suggest that understanding consciousness may need to involve non-traditional scientific methods. The difficulty in relating the phenomenal aspect of consciousness to the world as described in the traditional scientific method is known as the explanatory gap, the metaphysical gap between physical phenomena and conscious experience. Some divide problems of consciousness into two subsets, easy problems and hard problems, where easy problems are mental phenomena related to consciousness that can be explained using the scientific method, things like attention and thinking, usually explained using neural and cognitive mechanisms, for example, our perceptual ability to see the color blue. In contrast, hard problems are mental phenomena related to consciousness that cannot be explained using the scientific method. For example, why does the color blue make us feel something? Brain scans or questionnaires cannot reveal what it is like to experience. Qualia is a term used to describe the fact that there seems to be an intrinsic quality to experience. One of the simplest examples of this can be explained using sensory qualia. Our world is made up of frequencies, amplitudes, and molecules, which our perceptual systems decode into colors, sounds, and smells. These sensory experiences only exist if there is a brain to process that sensory information. Consciousness is what allows us to feel something in relation to a certain perceptual experiences. For example, the color blue has a different feel to it than the color red. Thoughts and feelings also have qualia. The thought of a loved one is different than the thought of an enemy. Some see qualia as the fundamental unit of experience or consciousness. Every conscious mental event must have qualia, and this qualia is what makes the event conscious. But there are skeptics who argue that qualia does not exist, and that all mental events can be measured with patterns of neural findings, arguing not that these feelings don't exist, but that these feelings are explainable rather than inexplicable. Drawing back to the point at the beginning, consciousness has components to which only the subject themselves is privy to. We cannot know what it is like to experience something that we are not experiencing ourselves. So, moving into some questions surrounding consciousness. Number one, fundamentally, what is consciousness? What are the properties of consciousness? Is this a process? Is this a mechanism? And if so, how can we explain it? How is consciousness and the mind related to physical matter? What events and areas of the brain are involved in what we know as the conscious experience? Who possesses consciousness? Is it just humans, or are animals conscious? Can computers and artificial intelligence have consciousness? Why are we conscious? For what purpose did consciousness evolve? Is the concept of consciousness consistent with evolution? And finally, what are the best methods to study consciousness? Can consciousness be studied empirically using the scientific method? And can the subjective nature of consciousness be studied? Subjectivity is the main divider between those who seek to answer these questions. Consciousness has puzzled philosophical and scientific communities alike for thousands of years. Studying and understanding consciousness is truly interdisciplinary in nature and involves input from many different fields. Currently, there is a multitude of work being done in this field on how the brain and its structures can give rise to the conscious experience. The meaning of consciousness we know only as long as no one asks us to define it. We have now reached the end of the introduction. Please pause the video here and refer to the worksheet to answer the multiple choice questions outlined on the screen below.
Hi everyone, I will be discussing the evolution of the human brain, which is foundational to our understanding of how the brain works and its relation to consciousness, which will be further discussed in the presentation. When thinking about the term evolution, most people are familiar with Charles Darwin and his famous work investigating the origins of evolution in humans. Similarly, T.H. Huxley looked into the evolution of the brain in conjunction with human evolution from past ancestors to present-day Homo sapiens. His work is published in some chapters of Darwin's books, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. The human brain is a complex organ that we are still currently trying to investigate and understand its evolution and function. Based on what we have discovered and learned from the evolution of humans, we can draw similar parallels to the evolution of the brain. As outlined in the image above, with the changes and modifications in skeletal structure and stature of past human ancestors, adaptations in skull size and cranial capacity can also be observed. Beginning with skeletal structures in the evolution of various hominid species, major changes included the upright stance with forward-facing eyes, opposable thumbs, rotating limbs and joints, and adapted skull positions with the foramen magnum, which is the location where the spinal cord attaches to the cranium, shifting downwards to support the upright position that makes it easier for walking on 2 feet. Furthermore, this adapted skull position also highlights the larger cranial capacity, alluding to a gradual increase in brain size. However, questions arise on why these adaptations have arisen and how they take place. Recent genomic analyses have pointed towards specific genes that may be responsible for the increase in brain size. The Notch2-NL family of genes has been found to be implicated within brain size regulation, as these target genes promote the renewal of neural progenitor cells, resulting in the production of a greater number of neurons and an overall greater brain size. The abnormal spindle-like microcephaly-associated gene functions similarly by promoting the division of neural progenitor cells during early brain development. This leads to a greater number of neurons and an overall larger brain size. Lastly, another gene involved in brain size is the ARHGAP11B gene. This gene has recently been discovered to only be present within the closest human relatives, such as the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. This gene functions by triggering neuronal stem cell proliferation, leading to a larger population of stem cells. These stem cells can then further differentiate into specialized nervous system cells, such as those found in the cerebrum, resulting in increased development and size of the cerebrum. This gene is also associated with higher levels of intelligence, as the cerebrum is associated with higher cognitive functions and decision-making skills. Overall, these genes function together to increase the brain size. Many studies investigating the increased brain size and volume of recent human ancestors have also associated this development with an increase in intelligence as well. However, there is also a correlation between brain size and body size of animals. This provides a challenge to the aforementioned logic behind the increased brain size and increased intelligence, as some animals are larger than humans and may have larger brains, despite humans surpassing their intelligence levels and cognitive functions. This leads into recent research pointing towards increased neuronal count associated with the increased intelligence and higher order thinking. The increased number of neurons and increased cerebral blood flow rate is associated with the increase in brain size and volume as the brain expands to meet the increased cerebral metabolic needs of the growing brain. Furthermore, the increased neuronal count in the brain highlights the importance of these cells towards overall higher order brain function and development. Based on this research highlighting the importance of neurons in relation to the brain, many researchers investigated what exactly are neurons. In simple terms, neurons are the basic functional unit of the brain and nervous system. These cells function to detect and carry messages to and from the brain via electrochemical signals. These signals are transmitted across neurons through action potentials to transmit sensory information to the brain and transmit motor responses to the visceral limbs and organs. There are many different types of neurons in the brain as well, both structurally and functionally. Action potentials are changes in membrane potential, which function to transmit signals across neurons. As outlined in this GIF, the action potential is received through the dendrites of the neuron and then transmitted along the axon towards the synaptic terminal, where it's passed to other accessory structures. The steps in an action potential involve depolarization, where sodium ions are transported into the cells, making the cell more positively charged. Once it reaches a threshold level, the action potential is triggered, resulting in repolarization of the neuron, where it attempts to return to its resting membrane potential. However, the cells become too negatively charged, causing hyperpolarization. The sodium-potassium ATP pump then functions to return the neuron to its resting membrane potential. These steps are repeated as the membrane potential changes to accompany the transmission of the electrical signal along the neuron. The ability of neurons to transmit signals between each other and to other cell types in the body make neurons very unique and different from all other cell types in the body. Neurons possess many characteristics that enable higher-order function in humans. Synapse formation is the ability of neurons to form connections with other neurons. As neurons develop and humans mature, these neural synapses and connections are strengthened. Furthermore, as certain synapses are not used as often or are forgotten, neural pruning occurs, which involves the elimination of unused synaptic connections. Through this process of synapse formation and neural pruning on the pathways of connection between neurons, humans are able to learn and create connections and links between different things in their mind. Another important characteristic of neurons is their ability to reform and reorganize their neural networks and their synaptic connections. This is known as neuroplasticity. This characteristic makes neurons unique in their abilities to relearn and change behaviors. It is also the foundation behind the complexity of the brain and its structure. Overall, these processes function to reinforce and enhance the neural pathways created in the brain in relation to learned behaviors and consciousness, which is the basis used for the development of neural networks for machine learning and artificial intelligence in current technologies. Similar to the evolution of the brain, the evolution of human behavior has also evolved over time. With the external skeletal adaptations as previously discussed, behavioral adaptations also arose. From tree-dwelling environments and lifestyles, hominids have adapted to walking on 2 feet and started the formation of communities. These communities also highlighted the development of art, history, technology, and innovation. With this evolution of human behaviors, questions arose regarding our own physiology and thinking, leading to our exploration of consciousness. As a result, evolution of human behavior has occurred synchronously with adaptations in the brain. Our understanding of neurons and their unique characteristics aid in investigating our own consciousness. This is emphasized by Crick's astonishing hypothesis, where he argues that our understanding of human behavior is based on our understanding of the behavior of neurons both individually and collectively. By exploring how neurons experience consciousness collectively and by localizing its functions, we can draw parallels to the overall brain and human body experiencing consciousness as a whole. Based on this premise, current technologies explore the potential of mapping consciousness through mapping neural networks and connections between neurons. However, the brain remains to be both structurally and functionally complex, proving a challenge towards researchers aiming to uncover consciousness and its functions. Despite this challenge, great progress has been made, and from what we have learned so far, the foundation behind understanding consciousness relies on our understanding of neurons and the overall evolution of the brain. So to conclude this section, here are some conceptual questions to consider when thinking about the evolution of the brain and its relation to consciousness. Take a minute to pause the video and think about these questions. What makes neurons so special from other cells in the body? Why does the evolution of the brain play a major role in uncovering the functions and abilities of the brain? And finally, is consciousness just a byproduct of the mechanisms behind neuronal or brain function, or is it more than that?
In this section, we'll begin discussing brain structure itself by moving from the familiar to the more detailed. When students first begin to learn about the brain and its role in conscious experiences, it is often initially presented as separate sections of tissues, each with their own specific tasks to complete and roles to play. This method does aid in understanding basic structures within the brain. This image is a good example, dividing up sections of the brain according to what they are known to be involved in. However, when exploring the roots of consciousness, it falls somewhat short of explaining where the conscious self may be found. With that in mind, we can focus in more detail on areas of the brain with known involvement in supporting consciousness. In particular, there are three large areas of the brain that are of special interest in our focus on consciousness. The first is the reticular formation, composed of a widespread net-like structure of neurons dispersed throughout the brainstem, which is the pink area in the center of this image. Second is the thalamus, the small gray structure in the center, which sorts information signals from the body and routes it to other parts of the brain. And finally, there's the cortex, the largest tan-colored folded area in this image, which is of crucial importance for all forms of perception and all control of voluntary movements. Let's look at each in more detail, starting with the reticular formation on slide 26. The reticular formation integrates portions of the central and peripheral nervous system, influencing consciousness, sleep-wake cycles, protective reflexes such as arousal and alertness, and supportive cardiovascular and respiratory functions. The reticular formation has two major signaling pathways called the ascending and descending tracts. The descending pathways play a physical role in maintaining posture and balance, controlling movement, and in relaying sensory stimuli, especially pain stimuli. However, the ascending tract, known as the ascending reticular activating system, or the ARAS, has significant neuronal populations in its tissue, with projections into the thalamus and cerebral cortex. This will come into play shortly when we introduce neuronal connection loops. Damage to this area of the ARAS can result in decreasing levels of consciousness and often even comas. The thalamus controls many vital subconscious activities within our body and brain, such as sleep, autonomic nervous system functions, and sensory stimuli collection and transmission to and from the cerebral cortex. The thalamus receives sensory stimuli impulses from the body's nerves. It translates the impulses into a sensation, and then transmits the sensation to the cerebral cortex for interpretation. As critical tissue for perception in general, the thalamus is responsible for relaying the vast majority of sensory input from the body. Scientific studies of the thalamus indicate it plays a crucial role in the cognitive emotional neural circuitry link, underpinning physiological conscious activity. On to the cerebral cortex on slide 28. The cerebral cortex is a thin, densely packed, and highly folded layer between 1 millimeter and 4.5 millimeters thick of what's called gray matter that encapsulates the cerebrum of the brain. In this image, the cerebrum is composed of all tissue contained in all four colored areas: purple, red, green, and blue. The term gray matter gets its name from its color, a light gray tone that occurs as a result of a high concentration of neuronal cell bodies. Cerebral cortex areas are named based on the lobe sections they overlap, namely the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. The cortex is actually two hemispheres, a left and a right, separated by a large groove called a sulcus. The two hemispheres are connected across the central sulcus by a thick fibrous band of nervous tissue called the corpus callosum. There are also many more small grooves, or little valleys, also called sulci, that occur due to the folded nature of the cortex. This folding of its tissue allows for significantly more densely packed nervous tissue than an unfolded layer, as the folding increases its surface area. This is a very important quality when we take into account the functional nature of neural interaction and connectivity in brain structures supporting consciousness. Of particular interest to scientists studying consciousness are the posterior sections, the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe can be further subdivided into the anterior parietal lobe and the posterior parietal lobe. We will come back to this in a minute when we discuss areas of the brain that are essential to functional consciousness, but first let's see what might not be essential. First, on slide 29, are three areas that may not be of critical importance. Let's start with the cerebellum. The question of interest here is what happens to consciousness if parts of the cerebellum, the little brain, are lost? And the answer is surprisingly little. Some deficits do occur, such as certain aspects of motor control, but hearing, sight, the sense of self, memory, and the ability to project awareness into the future are still functional. Does this mean that the cerebellum is not integral to consciousness or a conscious experience? The theory is no, that it may not be, and the reason why may be found in its neural circuit pathway design. They are described as exceedingly uniform and parallel, like batteries connected in parallel. The cerebellum is almost exclusively a feed-forward circuit. One set of neurons feeds the next, which in turn influences a third set. The important takeaway idea here is that in the cerebellum, there are no complex feedback loops with electrical activity passing back and forth. Next is the spinal cord and its connection to the brain. Loss of the spinal cord due to traumatic injury or degenerative diseases does have significant impact on bodily function, sensation, and voluntary and involuntary muscle control. However, its loss does not affect conscious awareness of the self. Finally, loss of portions of the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex can be most easily discussed using a very unique and well-documented case study, a man by the name of Phineas Gage. In 1848, in Vermont, in the US, an accidental explosion at a mine drove a 1.1 meter long tamping iron, which was 6 millimeters in diameter, through Phineas Gage's skull. It entered through his left cheek, under his left eye, and exited through the top of his skull, through the right anterior parietal aspect. Gage remained conscious and aware throughout the whole incident. He did eventually succumb to an infection as a result of the accident introducing bacteria into his skull, but with treatment he did recover. His physician at the time, Dr. Harlow, was quoted as saying that Gage remembers passing and past events correctly, as well before as since the injury, intellectual manifestations feeble, being exceedingly capricious and childish, but with a will as indomitable as ever, is particularly obstinate, will not yield to restraint when it conflicts with his desires. He was also fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires. The working theory from this medical evidence is that the prefrontal cortex, so obviously damaged in Gage's case, can cause profound personality changes, but without other neurological deficits. We've already discussed the brainstem, the thalamus, and the reticular formation and their important functions of consciousness. This leaves the cerebral cortex. Using Phineas Gage as an example, the loss of a portion of the frontal lobe does have certain interestingly negative effects: a lack of inhibition of inappropriate emotions or actions, motor deficits, or uncontrollable repetition of specific actions or words, but without demonstrating evidence that the drastic removal of frontal tissue significantly affected their conscious experience. However, the loss of even small regions of the posterior cortex can lead to a loss of entire classes of conscious content. This leads us to focus more closely in on the posterior cerebral cortex hot zone, the parietal, occipital, and temporal regions of the posterior cortex. Sights, sounds, and other sensations of life that we associate with conscious experience are generated by regions within the posterior cortex. A May 2011 study in Science supports the theory that conscious awareness develops from the electrophysiological flow of energy between brain structures, rather than from one or two structures acting independently. In the study, researchers in Belgium recorded and analyzed electroencephalographic EEG signals in patients with brain damage while they were being stimulated by specific tones. All of the patients were awake and alert, but with a range of responsiveness. Mathematical models built from the data suggest that feedback between the frontal cortex and the lower level sensory areas, like the thalamus and relay systems in the reticular formation we're focusing on in this presentation, is crucial to producing conscious experience. Simon van Gaal, a neuroscientist and researcher into the theory that conscious awareness results from shared electrical activity between areas of the brain, has conducted studies on the interconnectedness between areas of the brain of conscious and unconscious perception. He theorizes that independent activity in a certain region is not sufficient to generate consciousness, but the different regions must exchange information before consciousness can arise. In this figure, we can see a visualization of the fundamental theory behind the electrophysiological signaling in the brain. It is a dynamic process of reciprocal, bidirectional electrical pathways between neurons in different areas of the brain, fundamental to supporting conscious awareness. On the right side of the figure are circles depicting processing areas of the brain, starting with the ascending reticular activating system pathway we talked about as part of the reticular activating system earlier. Above that, the thalamus, then task negative network processing and task positive network processing. TNN and TPN processing occurs in the cerebral cortex in cortical connectivity loops and is related to the change of relayed sensory information to internal and external awareness, and then the development of conscious experiences, thoughts, and decisions. On the left side, we can see the increasing level of awareness that develops with each change in loop connection, as well as a rate change in the processing of the information. Lower levels in the brainstem and the thalamus tend to be faster as they're managed almost entirely unconsciously by the neuronal activity, while higher process levels, once the signaling pathways move into the cortical loops, tend to be slower and more controlled. It is at this point that any changes in the connectivity loops tend to be the most disruptive to conscious awareness, and in some cases cause individuals to lose self-awareness entirely. As a reflective exercise, think about the uniqueness of Phineas Gage. He experienced a very traumatic brain injury with personality changes, but no appreciable changes in his outward expression of functional consciousness. How is this possible? Scientific research and study areas are still trying to unravel how interconnected brain structures are and how they share information stored in electrical impulses to generate awareness and thought. We've also covered the importance of neuronal links and neuronal reciprocal connectivity pathways in this and in previous sections. How can conscious awareness exist or develop from electrical signals? How is a unique sense of self dependent on electrical impulses? In our next section, we will go farther into the future of technology and what is possible with artificial intelligence.
Here's a non-comprehensive list of projects and initiatives working on the challenge of mapping the human brain and turning it on its head. The projects are grounded in understanding the brain and inspired by the quest to uncover the essence of what makes us human. Some of the projects are focused on accelerating the development and application of innovative technologies. At the same time, other initiatives focus on deciphering how information is coded and processed in the brain, unraveling the codes within cells that govern their identity and function. Regardless of the specific aim, the overall result will be that researchers will be able to produce a dynamic picture of the brain that for the first time shows how individual cells and complex neural circuits interact in both time and space. These initiatives will fill significant gaps in our current knowledge and provide opportunities for exploring exactly how the brain enables the human body to record, process, utilize, store, and retrieve vast quantities of information all at the speed of thought. The Allen Institute for Brain Science recently mapped each of the 100,000 neurons and the 1 billion connections or synapses between them in a cubic millimeter of a mouse brain, a sample that's roughly the size of a grain of sand. The Mouse Brain Cubic Millimeter project is just one of several attempts with different species to map a nanoscale connectome. Neuroscientists believe that these efforts will give them insights into how neural circuits encode information and direct behavior, in short, how the brain works. The ultimate achievement is a nanoscale connectome of a whole human brain, which is still a long way off. The human brain has roughly the same number of neurons as stars in the Milky Way, around 100 billion. Using current imaging technology, it would take dozens of microscopes working around the clock, thousands of years to collect the data required. However, the advances in microscopy and development of more powerful computers and algorithms for image analysis have pushed the field of connectomics forward at a surprising pace. It was initially considered overly ambitious, but researchers now think that mapping the entire mouse brain, about 500 cubic millimeters in volume, might be possible in the next decade, making mapping the larger human brain a legitimate long-term goal. Brain mapping attempts to relate the brain structure to its function or finding what parts give us specific abilities. Researchers examine how our environment changes our brain structures by studying, for instance, how the brain changes physically through the learning and aging processes. Brain mapping also examines what goes wrong physically in the brain during mental illnesses and other brain diseases. Many different technologies and methods are used to study the brain structure and function. This slide highlights 2 new mapping methods for the comprehensive mapping of connections within an organism's nervous system. Newly developed techniques for measuring brain activity enable scientists to refine their theories about what consciousness is, how it forms in the brain, and where the boundaries lie between consciousness and unconscious. And as our understanding of consciousness improves, some researchers are beginning to build strategies for its manipulation, with the possibility of treating brain injuries, phobias, and mental health conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder and schizophrenia. This slide briefly lists some of the projects brain mapping technology is currently being used for by some of the initiative groups mentioned previously. New ways to treat, cure, and even prevent brain disorders have always been long desired by researchers. Alzheimer's disease is the most common neurodegenerative disorder for those 65 or older. It is believed that it currently affects at least 50 million people worldwide. Neuroimaging and brain mapping techniques offer extraordinary power to understand Alzheimer's disease, providing spatially detailed information on the disease's extent and trajectory as it spreads in the living brain. Computational anatomy techniques applied to large databases of brain MRI scans reveal the dynamic sequence of cortical and hippocampal changes with disease progression and how these relate to cognitive decline and future clinical outcomes. Discovering the nature of consciousness and curing paralysis are just a few of the applications that Elon Musk at his neuroscience company Neuralink believes electronic brain-computer interfaces will one day bring about. Elon Musk states that the company's long-term aim is to achieve a sort of symbiosis with artificial intelligence. Neuralink announced the development of a new brain-machine interface that could help people living with paralysis and those with brain damage to communicate and use technology without moving or talking. The brain implant enables closed-loop motor control and interaction with devices and applications. Currently, none of these advances are close at hand. However, Neuralink's ultimate goal is not to copy or reproduce the human mind. They want to focus on true interfaces between the human brain and the machine, which will enhance and improve us. Brain organoids are small blobs of neural tissue grown in the lab that resemble current human brain features. Scientists are hoping organoids will help better understand brain disorders and offer new insights into consciousness origins. Organoids are pluripotent stem cells that give rise to any cell in the human body. These cells are nudged to become brain tissue. They can be used as biological models of the brain and used as a unique testing ground for consciousness theories. With organoids, you will be able to do more than simulate. You can build systems that might exhibit different neurodynamics that we associate with consciousness and structure that we think may be important. What we know about consciousness is that it depends intimately on the brain, and the brain is part of the body that is sensing and interacting with the environment. At the moment, it is very unlikely brain organoids will become conscious. They would need many more neurons, and their different brain regions are not organized adequately to one another. And currently, these brain organoids can't undergo higher order thinking. Scientists are hoping that by starting with crude measurements and then applying them in various circumstances, we will begin developing a more sophisticated understanding of what consciousness is, which will allow us to develop better brain measuring devices for consciousness. Many of our thoughts for most people take the form of an internal dialogue. From this, we can guess that consciousness might be like talking to yourself, except that your mind takes a shortcut to avoid saying anything out loud. Could this be mapped? Stefan Larsona, a Boston-based neuroscientist and CEO of MetaCell, a neuroscience company, along with an international team of over 100 scientists, designers, and programmers, set out to do this when they formed the Open Worm project. In Stefan's TED Talks, he starts by asking if he took one neuron from your brain and replaced it with a computer code that did the same thing. Has he changed your identity? Are you now a different person because he's taken on one of your neurons and replaced it with a computer code? Would this change who you are? Another question to ask is, would he learn anything about your brain? Continue down this path, and now Stephen replaces 2, 3, 4 neurons, or even your entire brain. Then ask the same questions. If he took every neuron and replaced it with a computer code, would you be the same person, but now uploaded into a computer? By coding your entire brain, could you learn more? You would probably learn a lot about how your brain works. This project is called OpenWorm because it shows the C. elegans worm, the world's most understood multicellular organism that is a favorite of scientists because it's the simplest animal with this brain to study. Its entire body consists of 959 cells, of which 302 are neurons that form approximately 10,000 nerve connections. Yet, even with a small neural network, the worm can feed, mate, and evade predators and toxins. In 2015, the team uploaded their worm's brain into a Lego constructed robot, and the robot moved. The worm's nose neurons were replaced by a sensor, the motor neurons on both sides of the worms by actual motors. The software that the team created, and which was modeled on the neurons of the worm's nervous system, led to their robot hitting a wall and backing up and moving the other way. This was not a programmed act. It was a behavior derived from its connectome.
Understanding consciousness and neurobiology in general allows researchers like Elon Musk to integrate AI with human physiology. Both societal and economic ramifications could arise from the exploration and use of this technology. As you can imagine, researchers mapping consciousness face many ethical implications. Most research models use animals, and many techniques are quite invasive, like we see in this photo of the rat used in the development of Neuralink. Good ethical practices must be maintained in the lab. For example, scientists in Canada must receive training and follow the protocol outlined by the Canadian Council on Animal Care, as well as the Animal Welfare Act. The CCAC is a Canadian organization that enforces the good treatment of all animals used in lab experiments. Each project must be approved by the Council before animal use is allowed. Part of the CCAC's protocol is following the 3 R's: replacement, reduction, and refinement. Replacing the use of animals with other methods, reducing the number of animals required for a study, and refining husbandry practices all contribute to ethical research. Scientists must also follow the Animal Welfare Act protocol, which states that all animals must be free from hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, disease, injury, fear, distress, and must be able to express their natural behavior. An example of scientists practicing good ethical protocol was the BrainX experiment. They obtained the severed pigs' heads from a local slaughterhouse and had a sedative on standby in case the pig regained full consciousness during their experiment. 4 hours after the pig's death, BrainX perfusate, or synthesized blood, was circulated through the brain by connecting the system to the carotid arteries while mimicking the heart rate of the pig for up to 6 hours. The perfusate solution contained Hemopure, which is a hemoglobin-based oxygen carrier, so basically artificial blood, and a few other components. They found that the brain death does not occur at the moment of death, but rather sections of the brain die over several hours. No organized signaling was observed that suggested higher order brain functions or consciousness had been restored, but they were still prepared to prevent suffering if consciousness was regained. Newer imaging technologies involving artificial intelligence, which consist of machine learning, representation learning, and deep learning, are being used to detect various ailments such as tumors, psychiatric disorders, epilepsy, and hemorrhaging. This technology and others like it reduce the possibility of human error occurring. It's more efficient, and it's heavily used by radiologists. Deep learning by machines actually resembles a human neural network, as you can see in the photo. While humanoid androids may seem far away, researchers are actually getting pretty close. Engineers from Cornell University created a dynamic biomaterial using artificial DNA that exhibited life-like properties using DNA-based assembly and synthesis of hierarchical material, or DASH. Their biomaterial has its own metabolism, regenerative properties, it is self-sustaining, and it may be able to evolve since it could potentially reproduce other machines. Aside from those qualities, they were able to program the biomaterial to exhibit racing behavior using finite state automation or finite state machine polarized regeneration processes to create interference between FSAs as seen in this time-lapse photo. I'm sure you've already heard of robots replacing surgeries, but imagine if there were humanoid androids replacing doctors. Economically, society is already seeing robotics replacing human occupations such as assembly lines, and coded algorithms are being used for marketing programs such as Amazon and Wish. Such technologies will likely start popping up in places like fast food restaurants and grocery stores even faster now that the coronavirus pandemic has altered our way of life. Imaging technologies used in the medical industry are expensive, especially for those without health care. Without medical care coverage, one fMRI scan costs averages at $900 and an EEG is around $500. Some technologies are more expensive, but even if they are necessary or the best treatment option available, some people might not be able to afford them. While Elon Musk's Neuralink technology is more of a luxury, at least to some, the average initial cost of Neuralink is about $7,000. Over the years, the cost is expected to decrease to a few thousand, so $1,500 to $3,000, but once again, it's not going to be accessible for everyone. As most of us have learned, knowledge and innovation do not happen without consequences. Mapping consciousness could allow us to detect levels of consciousness and language comprehension, which could give doctors an edge when treating coma patients. Technology like this could also be used to understand the thoughts of other species. I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on what you learned from this presentation and think about what fully understanding the brain, human and other species alike, would mean for humanity. Could the brain be replicated into android technology or used in cloning? If we were able to cure neurodegenerative diseases and essentially prevent aging of the brain, and organ replacements were available, do you think it would be ethical to extend the lifespan of humans and other species, such as a beloved pet? As with any computer, a system can be hacked. So, is it really safe to be implanting computerized chips into our bodies? Would we be faced with ethical decisions regarding our humanoid android creations? Would universal communication be possible with the use of an implant like Neuralink? And how would that impact our cultural divide? In conclusion, you have hopefully learned about the evolution of the human brain, the areas of the brain associated with consciousness, some of the technologies linked to consciousness, future applications, ethical concerns, and a few of the potential repercussions of what this knowledge could mean for humanity and the classes of society. Neuroscience is an interdisciplinary practice, as you will have seen from this presentation. There is so much knowledge left to be discovered, which makes this an exciting area of research, especially now that the rate of technological advancements have been accelerating. I hope this presentation has been as interesting for you as it has been for all of us. Thank you, and before I end, I will leave you with this quote by Lao Tzu. Be the change you wish to see in the world.